I found out my father had died from a Facebook post, not a phone call, not a knock on the door. Post shared by a cousin with a photograph of my father's face and an obituary underneath it. And I read that obituary standing in a grocery store parking lot, and it listed him as survived by his loving wife, his daughter Marguerite, and his 3 grandchildren. I am his daughter. My name is not Marguerite. Marguerite is his stepdaughter, and I was not in the obituary at all. Let me back up, because to understand how a living woman gets deleted out of her own father's death notice, you have to understand the 2 years before it, and the woman who spent them quietly removing me, one photograph, one phone call, one form at a time, from a family I had belonged to my entire life. My name is Josephine Rourke. I'm 44 years old, and my stepsister erased me, not metaphorically, administratively, from the records, the rituals, the archive, the story, until the day my father died and the world was formally told he'd had one daughter, and it wasn't me. Let me tell you about my father. His name was Walter Rourke, and he was a plumber for 38 years, and he had hands like tree bark and an enormous, uncomplicated love for exactly 4 things. My mother, me, the Chicago Bears, and doing a job properly. My mother died when I was 19, cancer, fast, and for 11 years after that it was me and Dad. Sunday dinners, him fixing things at my apartment that didn't need fixing, me pretending I couldn't change a tap so he'd have a reason to come over. We were in the way of a widower and his only child, each other's whole remaining family. And then, when I was 30, he met Carol, and I was glad. I want to be honest about that because it matters later. I was glad. He'd been alone for 11 years, and Carol made him laugh, and I remember thinking, good, he gets some more life. Carol came with a daughter, Marguerite, 3 years younger than me, with 2 kids of her own and a third on the way. And Dad, who had a bottomless capacity for people, took to them immediately. He became Grandpa Walt to those kids inside of a year. He fixed things in Marguerite's house that didn't need fixing. I want to say clearly, none of that hurt me. He had room. I was 31 years old and secure in my father, and there was plenty of him to go around. The trouble was never that Marguerite got my father. The trouble was that Marguerite needed me not to have him. Let me tell you about my stepsister, because I've had a long time to think about her, and I've landed somewhere more complicated than she's evil. Marguerite's own father was a disaster, absent, then present, and worse, then gone. And into that hole walked Walter Rourke, who was steady and kind and fixed things. And Marguerite didn't just gain a stepfather. She got, at 32 years old, the thing she'd been missing her entire life, and she wanted it the way a starving person wants a meal, completely, without sharing. And I was the problem. Not because I did anything, because I existed. I was the proof that Walt had a daughter before her, a real one, blood, 31 years of Sunday dinners, and inside jokes, and a dead mother she'd never replace. Every time I was in the room, Marguerite was a stepdaughter. When I wasn't in the room, she was just his daughter, so she got me out of the room. Here's how you erase a person. It's slow, and every single step is deniable. The calendar. It started with logistics, Carol and Marguerite handling things, because Dad was in his 70s and it was easier. Birthdays, holidays, gatherings, and things started happening slightly without me. A Thanksgiving moved to a date I'd said I couldn't do. A birthday dinner I heard about after. Never a snub, always a mix-up and oversight. Oh, we thought you had that work thing. I'd learn about family events from photos. The phone. Dad's hearing went, and then his hands got bad, and using the phone became hard. So Carol answered it. And when I called more and more, he was resting, napping, out with Marguerite's kids. I'll tell him you called. Sometimes he didn't call back, and when I finally got him, he'd say, cheerfully, you don't call your old man anymore. And I'd say I call constantly, and he'd laugh, and I'd feel the ground tilt. The photographs. This is the one that tells you it was deliberate. Marguerite made photo books. Beautiful ones for Dad's birthdays, the family, the grandkids, the years. And I was in the first one, less in the second. By the fourth, I appeared once in the background of a group shot, unlabeled. Meanwhile, Marguerite's family filled the pages, and the captions began doing something I didn't notice for years. They said Dad where they meant Walt. Not Grandpa Walt. Dad. In a book he looked at every day for the last years of his life while his eyes and his memory both got worse. The forms, emergency contacts, medical paperwork, the nursing intake when he had his first fall. Carol and Marguerite handled all of it, and somewhere in that blizzard of forms, I stopped being listed. I found out much later that on his last hospital admission, the daughter listed as next of kin was Marguerite, with her phone number. Mine wasn't on the form at all. Do you see it? Not one of those is a crime. Every single one has an innocent explanation. And she did them for 2 years, patiently, while smiling at me at Christmas. Let me give you the 2 moments that I still can't put down. The first was a Sunday about 18 months in. I'd driven over unannounced because I'd had enough of the phone, and Dad was in his chair, and his face when he saw me was the face I'd known my whole life, total uncomplicated delight. And he said, Josie. And then he said, you don't come see me anymore. And I said, Dad, I was here 3 weeks ago. I texted you Tuesday. I call you all the time. And he looked confused and a little embarrassed, and he said, well, they tell me you're busy. They tell me you're busy. My father spent the last 2 years of his life mildly, quietly wounded that his daughter had drifted. Not because I had. Because that was the story that got told in his house, in 100 small mentions, by the people who answered his phone and filled his calendar and made his photo books. She never told him one big lie. She just narrated my absence into existence around a man whose hearing was going, and whose memory was going, and who had no way to check. That's what I mean by erasure, not that she took me out of the family. But she made my father, who loved me more than anything, slightly sad about me. The second one is the photo book, his 80th birthday. Marguerite presented it to a room full of people and everyone cooed and Dad went through it page by page with his thumb. The way he did, and I sat next to him and watched 40 pages of a family go by with me almost entirely absent. And then near the back, one picture of me from about 10 years earlier in the background of a barbecue unlabeled. And Dad stopped on that page, and he tapped it with his big cracked thumbnail and he said to the room proudly, "There's my Josie." Out of 40 pages. He found me in a crowd in the background of a picture from a decade ago. He was so pleased, and I sat there and smiled, and felt something in my chest go cold and permanent. Because I understood in that second that a person can be loved completely and edit out simultaneously, and that the editing doesn't need the love to stop. It just needs to control the paper. Let me tell you about the midpoint, because I want to be honest about my own part in this. I let it happen, not because I didn't notice I noticed, but every time I raised it, I lost. Because what do you say? I feel like I'm being left out of the calendar. You sound petty. I think she's taking me out of the photo albums. You sound insane. Carol would say, "Josie, sweetheart, nobody's doing anything to you." And she'd be so hurt on Marguerite's behalf, and I'd be the default stepdaughter making trouble in a family that had been through enough. And Dad, this is the part that hurts. Dad was old and getting confused, and he wanted peace. When I tried to talk to him about it once, he got distressed and he said, "Josie, please, everybody's good to me. Don't." And I stopped because he was 78 and frightened, and I loved him more than I needed to be right. So I made a decision. I decided to stop fighting for territory and just love my father directly, see him, call him, be his daughter, and let Marguerite have the calendar and the photo books and the forms, because those were props and I had the real thing. That was the mistake. That's the whole lesson of my story, and I'd tell it to anyone in the same position. The props are not props. The calendar, the forms, the albums, the contact lists, that's not the shadow of the family. That's the asterisk record of the family. And when the person you both love is gone, the record is all that's left, and whoever holds the record holds the truth. I let her have the record for 2 years because I thought I had the man. Then the man died, and I had nothing. Let me tell you about the day he died. He died on a Tuesday in a hospital at 4:40 in the afternoon. I found out at 9:15 the next morning, from Facebook, in a grocery store parking lot. Nobody called me. My father was dying in a hospital 7 miles from my house, for 6 hours, with his wife and his stepdaughter in the room, and not one person picked up a phone, because I wasn't on the form. Because I'd stopped being the emergency contact 2 years earlier, in a stack of intake paperwork Carol filled out, and no one had ever thought to fix it. And I've never resolved this. Someone had thought about it very carefully indeed. I wasn't there. I want to say that as plainly as I can, because everything else in this story is an argument about paperwork, and this is the thing the paperwork actually did. My father died and I wasn't in the room, and I will never get that back. And then I read the obituary. Survived by his loving wife Carol, his daughter Marguerite, and his 3 grandchildren. Marguerite wrote it. She'd had a night, one night, and in it, she'd written her stepfather's death notice and put herself in it as his daughter and left out his only child. That's not an oversight. That's a decision made in the 8 hours after a man's heart stopped. Let me tell you what that erasure actually costs, practically, because people think obituaries are sentiment. They're not. They're the first draft of the record. The funeral home works from it. The church works from it. The seating at the service works from it. And I turned up at my father's funeral, a funeral I'd found out about from a cousin, with no one having called me, to discover that the arrangement had been made without me and around me. Let me tell you about that funeral, because it's the worst 2 hours of my life, and it's the reason I couldn't let this go. I got there early, because I'm my father's daughter and he was never late for anything. And a young man from the funeral home met me at the door with a clipboard and asked pleasantly if I was with the Rourke family, and I said I'm his daughter, and he looked at his clipboard, and his face did something complicated, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have Marguerite down as the daughter. Are you a niece? Are you a niece?" I stood in a funeral home lobby and had to explain who I was to a 24-year-old with a clipboard, and he was so nice about it, and he went and checked with someone and came back and said they'd figure it out and put me in the 4th row. Because the front rows were the immediate family, and the immediate family had been specified in advance by the person who made the arrangements, and she had not specified me. The 4th row. Behind Carol, behind Marguerite and her husband and her 3 kids, behind Carol's sister and her husband. Behind, I want to be clear, people my father had known for 11 years. I sat in the 4th row of my father's funeral, my mother's daughter. The girl he taught to change a tap, 31 years of Sunday dinners, and I sat behind Carol's sister. And Marguerite gave the eulogy, 6 minutes. She was good, she cried in the right places, and it was warm. She talked about how Walt had come into her life when she needed a father, and had been *1, and how he'd taught her kids to fish, and how she'd never been able to call him anything but Dad. Not one mention of me, not one. Not his daughter Josephine, not Josie, not a nod to the 4th row. 6 minutes on the life of a man who had 1 child, delivered by the woman who wasn't her, in front of 200 people, half of whom had never met me. And afterward, in the receiving line I wasn't standing in, a woman I'd never seen touched my arm on the way out and said, kindly, "How did you know Walt?" "How did you know Walt?" I said, "He was my father." And she looked at me with the polite blankness of a person who has just been told something that doesn't fit anything she's heard, and she said, "Oh, how lovely," and moved on. That's the moment. Not the obituary, not the forms. That's the moment I understood what had actually been done to me, because a stranger at my father's funeral heard me say he was my father, and it didn't match the room. The room had been built without me. 2 years of small, deniable adjustments had produced a physical space containing 200 people in which my existence was a confusing claim. I didn't cry at my father's funeral. I want to tell you that I did, because that's what a daughter should do. But I sat in the fourth row and I did not cry, because I was too busy being bewildered asterisk, and I have never forgiven her for that either. She took my grief and replaced it with confusion. I didn't get to bury my father. I spent his funeral trying to work out my own standing. Let me tell you about the aunt, because she's the reason I'm not still a stranger. My father's sister. Aunt Dolores. 79 years old, brutal, deaf as a post, absolutely nobody's fool. She found me in the parking lot after the funeral. And she said, and I'll never forget this because it was the first true thing anyone had said to me in 2 years, "Why in God's name were you in the fourth row?" And I said something about mix-ups, and Dolores looked at me for a long moment and said, "Josephine, that woman put herself in Walt's obituary as his daughter and left you out. That's not a mix-up. That's a asterisk claim." She lit a cigarette right there in the funeral home parking lot at 79 years old. She's been at this a while, hasn't she? I've been watching those photo books. And then she said the sentence that ended 2 years. "You know I've got everything, don't you?" All of it, your grandmother's boxes, the albums, the papers. Walt gave me the family stuff when Carol moved in, said he didn't want it cluttering up the house. She exhaled. "You want to know something funny?" He said, and I'm quoting him, "Dolly, hang on to this for Josie. Let me tell you what was in the boxes, everything. 44 years of photographs, my whole childhood, my mother, me and Dad on every Sunday of my life. The ones that had quietly stopped appearing in Marguerite's albums, because Marguerite hadn't had access to these. She'd been carrying a record that Dolores had the original of, and documents. My father was a plumber. He kept things in a filing cabinet like a man who'd been burned once by a lost receipt. His will, the real one, with his lawyer from 4 years earlier, which named me first asterisk by name as his daughter before it named Carol, and a letter to me undated in his terrible handwriting that he'd clearly written after his first fall and never given me. It said, in part, "Josie, I know things have got strange. I'm not stupid, whatever anybody thinks. I let it happen because I'm tired, and I don't like fighting, and I've got maybe a couple good years, and I didn't want to spend them in a war. That's on me, kid, and I'm sorry. You're my daughter. You were here before all of it, and you'd be here if all of it went away tomorrow. If it ever comes to anything, Dolly has all of it, everything you'd need. She's meaner than me, and she doesn't get tired. Dad. I let it happen because I'm tired, and I didn't want to spend my last good years in a war. He knew the whole time. He was 78 and frightened, and he chose peace, and he hated himself for it, and he did the only thing he had the strength to do. He handed his sister the entire record of my existence and told her to hang on to it for Josie. Let me tell you about the reckoning. It was at the estate meeting, 3 weeks later, and Marguerite came in expecting a formality. Carol had already been telling people the will was being sorted out, and that things might be complicated. They weren't complicated. Walt Work was a plumber who kept his receipts. The will was airtight, 4 years old, drawn with a lawyer, and it named me. Carol had a wife's share, all of it clear and proper, and my father, who was fair to the bone, had left something to Marguerite's kids because he loved them, because he really had been their grandpa Walt. He hadn't cut anyone out. That's who he was. He just also, unambiguously in a legal document, named his daughter, and his daughter's name was Josephine Merck. But that's not the part I came for. I put the obituary on the table. "I want to talk about this," I said. Because everyone's been treating it as a formality, and it isn't. I read it out loud. Survived by his loving wife, his daughter Marguerite, and his 3 grandchildren. "Marguerite," I said, "you had one night, and you used it to write my father's death notice, and you put yourself in it as his daughter, and you left out his only child. That's not grief. That's not a mix-up. You made a decision in the 8 hours after his heart stopped." She started to cry and said something about being overwhelmed, about how of course she'd meant to include me, about how cruel I was being at a time like this. And I said, "Then explain the forms." And I laid them out. The hospital intake from 2 years earlier, listing Marguerite as daughter and next of kin with my name nowhere. The emergency contacts. And Dolores' photographs, in a stack 6 inches high. 44 years of a family with me in it, next to Marguerite's albums, where I disappear book by book like a woman being sanded off a wall. "I wasn't called when he died," I said, and my voice did the thing I'd been dreading, and I let it. "He was in a hospital for 6 hours, 7 miles from my house, and nobody called because I wasn't on the form. I found out my father was dead from Facebook in a parking lot. That's what the forms did. That's what all your little mix-ups were asterisk for asterisk. And then Dolores, who had come with me, put my father's letter on the table and said, 'Read it out, Josephine.' Read them what my brother wrote. I read it. I got to you were here before all of it, and you'd be here if all of it went away tomorrow, and the room was completely silent, and Carol had her hand over her mouth. Because she was hearing her husband say, in his own words and his own handwriting, that he'd known exactly what was happening in his house and had been too tired to stop it. And then the thing I hadn't planned happened. Marguerite's daughter, 19, home from school, sitting against the wall because there weren't enough chairs, said, 'Mom, why isn't Aunt Josie in the photo books?' Just that. A 19-year-old asking a simple question. And Marguerite opened her mouth and nothing came out, and her own daughter looked at her, and I watched my stepsister understand that the erasure had a witness she'd never counted on, the child she'd been raising inside it. Here is how it ended. Estate resolved as my father wrote it, because a plumber's 4-year-old will drawn with a lawyer is a very boring document to fight. Carol didn't fight it. I think, honestly, Carol had been carried along by her daughter more than she'd driven anything, and hearing that letter broke something in her. She apologized to me, months later, and it was real, and I took it. Marguerite and I do not speak. She has never conceded a single thing. Her position, to this day, is that she was overwhelmed and grieving, and that I have made her the villain of a family tragedy over a photo album. She may believe it. People are very good at not knowing what they've done. But here's the thing I actually got. I had the obituary corrected. It took a phone call and a small fee, and the funeral home was mortified. It runs now in the permanent online record, and it says, survived by his daughter, Josephine Merck. It's a small thing. It's also the only thing. Because in 50 years, when everyone in this story is dead, that's the sentence that will exist. That's what an obituary asterisk is asterisk. It's not sentiment, it's the last entry in the letter, and my stepsister understood that perfectly well, which is precisely why she wrote it the way she did on the one night nobody was watching. Dolores died 2 years later. She was, to the end, meaner than my father, and she never got tired, exactly as he said. I have the boxes now, all of it. And I've done the things she taught me. I've made copies, and I've written the names and dates on the back of every photograph in pencil, and I've told my own children where it lives, because I learned the hardest possible way that a family is not what happened. Family is what's recorded. Whoever holds the record writes the family, and if you love someone, you should know where the pictures are. My father died in a hospital 7 miles from my house, and I found out from Facebook, and I will carry that until I die. That's the wound. No cracked obituary fixes the 6 hours, but he knew, that's what I've got. Tired old man with bad hands, who couldn't fight and hated himself for it, sat down at some point after his first fall, and wrote his daughter a letter he never had the nerve to hand over, and then he did the one strong thing left in him. He gave the whole record of my existence to the toughest woman he knew and said, hang on to this for Josie. He couldn't stop them from erasing me while he was alive, so he made absolutely sure that somebody was holding the eraser-proof copy. She's meaner than me, and she doesn't get tired. She was Dad, she wasn't, and I'm in the obituary now where I always was, where I always am, survived by his daughter, Josephine Merck. That's me, it was always me.